I used to work in an old remote circus as a janitor, just a few miles down my house, cleaning out rooms and the stage after performance. It was an old popular circus that lasted for some time until I worked there, years before I grew up, as it used to go well business-wise from how well it ran and people loving it, and was an icon to any other circus, famously known. Just outside the circus, a bit down the road, in between two tree lines, was a sign that said, "Welcome to East River Circus," with a few painted clowns on it juggling balls. That's when I knew I was there. I went there a few times as a child, but for some odd reason, they would always change some of the performers acting on stage, as there were always different ones every time I went to visit, even some who worked outside in the theme park. But I loved going there. It was the best circus I went to as a kid, but only had been there a few times before I got my job there years later. I remember my favourite part of the circus was the animals, particularly the lions. East River Circus is closed down now, as it ran out of business and no longer was the leading star of child's fun. But it hadn't been taken down. It was just left there still standing, to be deserted. Now the remote large tent is left rotting away, along with the stage, chairs, entire playground equipment, food sheds and rides to be no longer used. It is now more of a creepy place that would go good for an apocalypse or ghost haunting horror movie. I knew this because around every block and street had a sign stuck onto traffic poles telling people that East River Circus is now closed. When I worked there, I was told not to walk in the basement room. I remember as a kid, and it was one of the few parts of the circus that stayed the same. It was always locked, but I could sometimes hear strange sounds coming from down there. I was wondering if they kept some of the animals down there. I never noticed it as a kid because of the circus noises, or maybe whatever was making the noise beyond the door, they didn't have it back then. Whenever I bring up the basement to anyone why it was locked, they simply just gave me some excuse or walk away from me, deliberately avoiding my question. Some would even shout at me, telling me that it wasn't any of my business, which seemed rather harsh from just a question, but that's not what bothers me. Every time they figured a way to get out of my question about the basement, they always had worried looks on their faces that they were obviously trying not to show, like I reminded them of a past memory that haunts them, maybe even something that still could be happening. And this was everyone I asked. Everyone seemed scared about this basement but me. It was like I was the only one who wasn't paranoid about this darn basement, because whatever it was, I was too new to have found out what was going on. I don't know why the basement was always kept locked. I just wanted to find out what it was. Why hadn't they told me yet? Were they ever gonna tell me? Were they hiding something in there they shouldn't be and worried that I'd report it to the police or anyone who's not a worker at the circus? On the other hand, I could just be getting overexcited about this whole basement thing. But as it was all too weird and seemed very suspicious, I wasn't sure. It was great working there, reliving my childhood, but never seemed to like my job much, and sometimes while on break, I'd come in late or sometimes be caught slacking, as I didn't really like my job and never really cared if I was fired from it. And my employees started to get annoyed with my regular laziness. Zach, who used to be one of my associates, who too did poorly at his job as well and didn't put the best in his work, just one day disappeared without a trace. The last I saw him was smoking, sitting on the stage during lunch, just as I was leaving early from a bug I caught, and he never turned up after that. I asked a few people I worked with if they seen him, but they hadn't a clue where he'd gone. Maybe he was eventually fired after he slacked in his work, but no one has seen him ever since. One of the guys who looked after the keys in the room came up to me one morning as I was cleaning up chips and rubbish at the dodging car line in the theme park and said to me, "If you know what's good for you, you'll do your job right. If you know what's better for you, you'll pack your things and leave, getting out of this place as soon as possible." I was dead right confused. I had no idea what he meant by that. His face resembled worried. I noticed a tear running down his cheek just as he went to turn away and head back to his next task. Now this was just equally strange as his secret to why the basement door was always locked. Even though I tried not to let it worry me, I just couldn't kill the curiosity. It just seemed so weird how the basement was always kept locked and no one told me why. Why was it such a huge secret that they kept from the outside? It just didn't seem right, so I decided if no one was going to tell me what was going on with this darn basement, I'd find out myself and end this huge fuss. So one day on our lunch break when everyone went outside, I crept my way into the room where they keep all the keys and grabbed the keys to the basement door, which was hung up at the back wall, separated from the other keys for a good reason I guessed, and walked to the basement, being cautious not to be seen unlocking the door. I was nervously terrified as I looked down and could only see long black stairs from the dark. Getting the darker the deeper they go, and they were so long I couldn't see the ground, only black. Before I began to merge in, I just started thinking about what that guy told me. Could it have something to do with the basement? I started walking down the end of the stairs and finally reaching the bottom as the noises got louder and more creepier as I realized it was growling and banging on the bars. Now I was sure there were animals down there. Maybe they were hiding some means of animal abuse. As I went to turn back and listen to my paranoid instincts that were telling me to, as I wasn't supposed to be there in the first place, until I noticed the room as my eyes slowly adjusted to the dark. It was an old circus makeup room. This must be where the old circus was, underground. The room was freezing. I felt around blindly for a switch until my hands finally touched something on the wall, turning on a dingy dull light but illuminated enough of the room for me to see. The room looked a little crude. I continued walking through this creepy room, looking at old photos of clowns and freaks on the wall that would have been the old circus carnivals. I swear, a couple images was one of the older of my colleagues working at the circus, but I couldn't tell exactly. And next to the picture was an engraved message on the wall carved into it. It read, "Don't bludge if you don't want to hold a grudge." Woof. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Whatever it means. I forgot about it and continued searching for a performance room, exploring the ancient acting base until I noticed another door in a single dress-up room near a closet. I went to open it and surprisingly it was unlocked. Even though I hoped it was locked, I walked in for my curious reasons, fearfully discovering it was another basement. The stairs were also long, but nowhere near as long as the first stairs I walked down. There was a strong odour coming from down there. It smelt disgusting. I anxiously started walking down the steps. As I got to the bottom, I found a frightening discovery just as I realised that I wasn't supposed to be down here. It was no innocent circus room. It was a dungeon. The room wasn't cold like the first one. It was sticky and moist with a humid atmosphere. The smell was foul, reeking the entire room. There were rats roaming the place as their home. I see skeletons of deformed people and the brains and stick in a pot, presumably was fire, knowing that the old circus was keeping these freaks imprisoned in these cages. I couldn't find a light in this room. At the back corner, next to another dark doorway, was something hanging off the ceiling with something tied up, attached to it, that was dripping a liquid on the ground with an odouring puddle underneath it. It was dark, so couldn't see what it was. I don't know why I didn't turn back then. I looked to the other side at the right of me, where there was only one cage, and what I saw has been tattooed in my brain. I walked closer to the large single cage and found on the rotting ground the corpses of mangled bodies, or skeletons now, but some still had decaying flesh on them. Most bodies were being eaten by a few of the rats, where the last pieces of the flesh remained. Many of the bones were all smashed with shattered pieces coating the floor. They looked like a bear or some sort of giant animal did this to them. I looked up to see a message in blood on top of the cage on the wall. Learn from your mistakes and your lessons won't go down in vain. I started to assume that they brought employees who worked at the circus who didn't do their job right down to the room to show them the brutal death punishment they would meet if they didn't do as instructed, so they would do as told. As I stood outside the cage, exploring hand and footprints, all blooded, that had been dragged through the dirt ground, realizing that they were not alone, and that something was down here with them, hurting them. Just as I was expecting these prints even further, I find something else far more shocking. In the dirt was various prints of disfigured huge feet that must have been a little larger than a 30cm ruler, with 4 toes that was unrecognizable to determine what it belonged to, along with claw marks that scraped the wall. There were another pair of prints in dirt that were almost the same size as the others. It resembled handprints. The 3-fingered prints in the dirt looked all twisted and mangled. Whatever it was dragging these misshaped people and ripping them apart. Now I realized that this room was a feeding room to some sort of animal. At least I think it was, but as those prints were so unnatural looking, I wasn't sure what it really belonged to. The circus freaks who I guess couldn't perform were thrown into these cells, trapped behind the bars, and one by one were taken out across the cage on the other side and being fed to whatever this thing was, while the associates watched and just waited to be next. There were a few more distinct claw prints outside the cage, leading to the back corner door at the end with what looked like a trail of fresh blood following them. As I puzzled all of this together and turned to the door I came in, as I decided not to explore any further after what I had just witnessed, I hear behind me from the back corner of the room, walking out the door where the prints were and that thing was hanging, a crawling noise as I turned back around as my eyes slowly adjusted to the dark again. I could slightly make out that there was some sort of hairy man-like creature that was staring me down on the other end of the room. It had a few hairless patches over its body, with some scarred tissue and blisters on its few parts of skin that was exposed, that looked as if being burnt off. It resembled a human, but not quite, with a humanly body frame, with a mix of something else. When it started to slowly approach me, I heard its heavy breathing, which I started to smell stinking of corpse as it got closer, dragging itself on all fours until it got up on its hind legs, standing at least 7 feet. Its arms were unnaturally long, reaching to the tip of its knees. Its few fingers were all mangled and bent with giant sharp claws at the end of them covered in blood. Its teeth was large, pointy and blooded, and it had the body of an anorexic bodybuilder. When I went to turn back rapidly after staring at that thing for a few seconds, the giant creature lunged after me, starting from the other side of the room only like 20 meters away, and when it got close and fast enough, made a very long jump towards me, but I stepped behind the barrel and dodged it. It once again turned and ran towards me, waving its claws at my face, but grabbed a rickety old shovel I found on the ground, breaking it over its head, quickly turning and making my way back up the stairs. As I was about halfway, I don't know why, but made the stupid mistake of stopping and turning around, and saw it get up on its fours again, crawling up the stairs after me, growling loudly, aggressively. It was fast, but I was already way ahead of it before it made its next move, but I still had to run to the end of the other room and climbing up those mountain of stairs before I was safe again. I was running out of breath, but I needed to stay alive before that thing got me. I was just at the last top steps of the last stairway, but tripped over and fractured my knee. I was lying on the steps for a few seconds, groaning, but started crawling up the last 5 when I heard it coming closer. I made it through the door, feeling its heavy breathing on my neck, quickly turned on my side to close it, but it managed to fit its long arm in, reaching out, clawing inches from my face as I kept my head back as far as possible, but I couldn't close it. The thing was too strong. It was starting to push the door open, getting through while its claws drew nearer to my face. I reached one hand in my pocket, realizing I'd kept the pocket knife in there, and struck it in the beast's hand as it yelled in pain and anger. Then when its arm was out, I quickly closed the door, locking it. I screamed for help and a huge crowd came running, surrounding me, and a few of the younger people came to my aid, helping me, including the one who minds the keys, and he looked happy that I was safe, but horrified. He looked back at the boss and a few of the other staff that had been working there for a while, with a suspicious look on his face. I told them that I was getting far too puzzled about why this door was always locked, so I explained to them how I snuck in the room to grab the keys and enter the forbidden basement, as I didn't ponder about walking down there, and when I made it to the second basement, where I didn't go any further, I found all corpses and skeletons of the bodies of people, and some of them looked different as to being deformed, and that some sort of creature lunged after me to attack, where I escaped by driving the knife through its hands after getting its arm in. They called the ambulance and I was taken away, recovering in hospital. After getting out of hospital the next day, I quit my job, handing all my equipment back to my boss, and never went near the East with the circus again. My boss looked a little nervous to what I found out. I took regular psychiatry and counselling help after the dreading encounter I had from the basement. Even suffered from night terrors where I wake up in bed paralysed with that thing in my room, slowly crawling towards me with its long claws. Even dreams of waking up in a dungeon. Whatever it was, I have no idea what that thing was they've been hiding down there all those years. I just think how it survived down there. They must have known it was there, as why to keep the door locked, and must have been feeding it. But what? And how? Thankfully I'll never know. I reported what had they kept hiding down there to the police, but instead described it as a large number of dangerous animals, so it'd believe me and will bring extra reinforcement, and ever since, I never knew what happened to that place before it closed down. I wonder what the police thought when they found it, and what they did to it. Time has passed, but I can still visualize the image of that monster that I know I'll never forget. I just think how lucky I was to have just escaped that thing with no more than a second, and if I was any slower, I would have ended up like those in the lower basement, ripped to shreds limb by limb. I wouldn't be alive to explain the grisly truth about East River Circus. I just wonder why the old circus slaves didn't report it to the police after all that had been happening. They were kept as prisoners and food if they didn't push the work harder. I suppose it was because the circus was their home. There wasn't a place for these abnormally looking convicts to go, and the circus was nowhere near town. It was isolated out of state. Sometimes I think to myself if I should go back to visit the abandoned wasteland, now as it is, just to see what it's like reliving, not my childhood, but my nightmare when I worked there. A memory I could never erase, even in my craziest mind telling me to visit the basement right down to the dungeons. But I know I won't. Whether that thing is dead, most likely if it was still there, I wonder if it was there still. I know now why every time I went there for a visit as a child, they hadn't always used the same performers. I also think I know behind Zach's disappearance, what happened to him. Now that I remember all of this, in the room where I grabbed the keys was single photos of some of the old circus employees that I saw in the photo in the basement with a few disfigured people with a circle and a cross through their picture pinned up on the wall. Then I saw something most peculiar. It was a picture of myself with a circle, but not yet a cross.